Well, welcome, 8 Colby. Hopefully, we've managed or you've managed to access this YouTube vodcast. My name is Dr. Hart, and I can't be with you today in person. So, what I'm actually doing is I'm creating a vodcast. That means that I'm actually creating a film and streaming it to YouTube so that you can access it. I'm doing that because A, I want to get started in Year 8 history straight away, and B, there's nothing worse than your first day of a new course doing something really boring. So I really hope this isn't boring, and I hope it does give you an orientation to Year 8 history. Now, at the moment you can see me down the bottom of the screen looking absolutely delightful. It's Sunday night and I'm in my tracksuit wearing my headset. I'll remove that shortly and hopefully you'll recognise my photo there. You'll know who I am, and on Wednesday in class I'll be meeting you in person. So let's get started. What will you be doing for the rest of the year in Year 8 history? Well, I actually think it's a really exciting course. There's a specific focus for Year 8 history, and that focus is on medieval times, also known as the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. Now, medieval times followed on from the Roman Empire. Now, if you think back to Year 7, you may have studied ancient Rome. Ancient Rome was an enormously successful civilization that lasted 1,000 years. We're going to start our study with the fall of Rome. Our big question will be, after this great civilization that had an enormous number of inventions and innovations, after they fell, what happened to Europe? Well, it descended into chaos. Lots of fighting, lots of barbarian tribes. We're going to investigate medieval Europe. We're going to talk about sword, plough and cross. In other words, we're going to come up with a way of understanding how people lived, why they did things they did, and perhaps why society was structured in particular ways. We're going to have a look at some of the really big people in medieval times, the famous people, particularly Charlemagne or Charles the Great. We're going to have a look at what ordinary people did. What was everyday life like for people in medieval times? We're then going to have a look at a really interesting period in time. We're going to look at the Black Death, also known as the Black Plague. If you remember the song Ring a Ring a Rosy, a pocket full of posy, you've already heard of the Black Death. That song is in fact a song about the Black Death. One of the symptoms of the Black Death was that you would come up in big red or rosy circles all over your body. Unfortunately, they'd become pus-filled and you'd later die. So the Black Death, what did that do to medieval Europe? How did it change the way in which people lived their lives? Well, quite dramatically, because over half the population of Europe died. We're then going to compare medieval Europe with medieval Japan. Now, Japan wasn't affected by the Black Death, and that's largely because it's geographically very distant. It's an island, so the Black Plague never got to Japan. So we'll be looking at a period of Japanese history called Shogunate Japan, the time of the great shoguns. Hopefully, you'll find that really exciting. So we're going to be having a look at roughly 900 years of history in the next 2 terms. Now, rather than do lots of minute detail of events and what happened, we're going to talk about it in terms of concepts, how people managed to organise themselves, how they made decisions, what those decisions were based on. Hopefully you'll find this pretty exciting. So, let's start talking about medieval history. When I mention medieval history, many people think about knights. They think about the broadsword that knights often held, and they think about armour. This is a picture from a game, and I think that game is called Total War Medieval. And what you see here is that sort of really stereotypical view of knights and what knights were all about. You'll see here he has obviously his heraldic symbol on his shield, and in the background you can see some castles. So these are the kinds of images that might come to your mind when you think about medieval history. Another image, again from a game, hopefully You aren't playing the game Total War, but I dare say some of you might be. So here is a crusader. This is a crusader knight, and we can tell he's a crusader knight because of the big red cross here. He's got a broadsword here, very different to the samurai swords used by the Japanese. But the crusaders are a really interesting bunch of people. These knights were part of a holy, I guess, pilgrimage to go back and take land that had been conquered by the Muslims. So we'll be learning about the interaction, Christian and Muslim. I think you'll find it interesting. Samurai. We'll be talking about shogunate Japan. And when you hear the term samurai, often you might think about this kind of image. The very distinctive samurai helmet. The sword, this sword here, is a very different sword to the sword used by the European knights. This is a katana, and it's a much finer sword. Ladies, when you think of medieval times, you might think of the fashion, what people wore. Believe it or not, one of the most dangerous things women could do in medieval times was have children, because childbirth was really, really risky. Often women died during childbirth. And certainly the kinds of health conditions and education we take for granted today didn't exist then. The other image that we see these days is that notion of the middle-aged hero or heroine, the middle-aged warrior, and sometimes we might see women portrayed as almost male-like figures in medieval times. Of course, that comes from shows like Game of Thrones. Now, none of you will have seen this show because you're far, far too young. I'm joking when I say that because I'm sure many of you have seen it. I myself am a bit of a Game of Thrones addict. But it does give us some misperceptions, misunderstandings about what medieval history was all about. So do games like this, Total War, Shogun 2. Sure, they key us into thinking about what people might have worn, but they certainly don't reflect what life in medieval times was like. So I want you to start to think about, how do we know what happened in the past? In your most immediate past, when you think about your family, how do we know what happened in the past when it comes to your specific family? You can talk to people. But when we're talking about history that is 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, very hard to talk to people that have already passed on. What we can do, however, is look for evidence that they've left behind. This is some textual evidence. This is actually a medieval scroll written in Latin. We can actually have these transcribed. We can have them translated so that we can read them and we can understand what people thought and did at the time. So one thing we'll be looking at in this course is historical evidence. As well as written evidence, there's also visual evidence. So these are artworks, medieval artworks. And what they show us here is the plough, the world of work, how people worked. Here we're talking about peasants. So they show us a lot about how society was structured, the poor people, the rich people, who did what. There are other kinds of visual pieces of evidence that reveal some really interesting insights into how people or what people believed. This is actually a doctor, a witch doctor if you like, and it's from the Black Death. And this witch doctor is wearing a very strange leather mask. The beak of that leather mask is actually filled with herbs because they believed that by breathing that you would somehow be immune to the Black Death. That wasn't the case, and we'll be looking at the Black Death and some of the strange things people thought you could do to avoid catching the Black Death. It included things like swimming in the sewer, because the plague would avoid the stench of the sewer. I'm pretty sure swimming in the sewer might actually expedite you catching the Black Death or dying of some other kind of horrible disease. Here is a graphic that shows you two people in the throes of the Black Plague, and here you see the big bulbi, the big lumps on them that would form before they died. So we know that this was a particularly horrendous period of time. Now, before I get you to do some work today, I want you to come up with your medieval name. Yes, I want you to come up with a medieval name using this particular diagram, and that's the medieval name you're going to introduce yourself to me on Wednesday with. So what you need to do, and I've asked the teacher here in a moment to pause this so you can do it, you need to pick your birth date. So your birth date, the number, it's going to be 1 to 31. Ladies, if your birthday, like mine, is on the 16th, your first name will become Isolde. Gentlemen, if your birthday is on the 25th, for example, your name will become Kane. Your birth month then becomes your last name. So for me, I'm February. My name is now Isolde Green. I thought this would be a bit of fun. It's actually not historically accurate whatsoever, but a bit of fun. So can we please pause this for a moment while everyone comes up with their medieval name? Make sure you write it down, because I'm expecting on Wednesday that you will introduce yourself by your medieval name. So now it's over to you. I want to know a bit about what you know about history, what you are interested in, what you feel, what you think about history. To do that, I need to get you to start to think about history a bit more. So what I'd like you to do is copy this table down into your workbook or onto a piece of lined paper. It says at the top, name 3 people from the past who you find interesting and explain why. Now, I understand that many people in your lives, in your family, are people from the past, and your present, of course, and that you might find them interesting. But for the purpose of this activity, I'd like you to name 3 people you don't know from the past who you find interesting. Don't limit yourself to your lifespan. You're all either 13, 14, 15 years of age. Start to think more, long term, more globally here. Who are 3 people that you may have heard about, you may have an interest in, and explain to me or write down why you find them interesting. I'll ask the teacher now to pause this so that you're able to do it. Now that you've thought about 3 people from the past that you think are important and you've explained why, I want you to think about 3 events from the past that you feel have been important on a global scale and explain why. Now, you mightn't know that much about these events. That's okay. The fact that they have piqued your interest is enough. Now, what I don't want you to do is I don't want you to focus on your personal life or personal history here. I want you to think bigger than that. So whilst your birth was undeniably a really important event for you and for the people in your life, I don't want to read your birth as one of these events. Okay? I want 3 events from a world, global stage sort of focus. 3 events, why you think they've been important. Let's go. So the third activity that you're going to be doing this lesson is to watch a 2-minute clip, and this clip is called The History of the World in 2 Minutes. What I'd like you to do as you watch this is I'd like you to mentally take a note of all the things you recognise. Let's get going. Okay, now that you've seen that, I want you to write a list of all the things you recognize. So every image that you recognize, dot point it, write a list. You should be able to get 15 or 20. Start now, and I'll ask your teacher to pause the video, please. So I'm going to ask you to watch this clip for a second time, and at the end of this I'm going to ask you a question, and that question is going to be, what do you think is missing from this? If we're to accept that this is the history of the world in 2 minutes, what images, events, people are missing? Let's have a look. Okay, so if we've got to the end of this, I've estimated time well. I hope so. I hope this has been okay, given that I'm not there, and that your first day without the teacher is sometimes be a bit tough. I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday. Until then, au revoir.